Hey everyone. What exists? Why does anything exist at all? Why is there not just nothing? Well, nothing is that which doesn't exist, so that's like asking why does there not just exist non-existence? Non-existence is never. Existence is always. So what does exist? What exists fundamentally and absolutely is the exact opposite of what exists fundamentally and absolutely. What exists fundamentally and absolutely is the exact opposite of what does not exist fundamentally and absolutely, which is nothingness. It's easy for us to think of what nothing is, but it's impossible for us to think of what nothing is. We can't think of nothing because, as Parmenides says, to think is. To think of nothing would be to think of what is not. We can't think of what is not. So, what is the opposite of nothing? It is everything. What is this everything? I call it Simnia. Simul omnia, the combined everything. It sounds kind of like a name, but I think of it more of like a philosophical term. What is Simnia? So it is everything. It is pure potential of everything that exists. What are its qualities? So let's quickly go through the qualities again. It is in stasis. It cannot change. Why? Well, a few things. For one, it can only be one thing. There can only be one fundamental thing that exists. Because if there was multiple things that were fundamentally existent, what would separate those things? Like, let's say we had two things that were fundamentally existent. What would separate those things? If we were to say, oh, well, let's say nothingness somehow separates those things. Now we're giving existence to something that doesn't exist. So we can't use nothingness because that doesn't exist. Okay, so let's say, well, maybe a third thing separates those. What separates the third thing from those two? Now a fourth thing, infinite, goes on for infinite. So it can only be one thing. So first of all, whatever exists, it has nothing else to change into. And then we also can use, these are all basically Parmenides arguments. Because Parmenides basically explained this fundamental existence. It also, if it were to be able to change, it would have past and the future, and a future. What is the past? It is what no longer exists, and what does not exist is never. And what is the future? It is not existent yet. And what is not existent is never. So we see it is completely uniform. It's one thing, it can't change, it is in stasis. It is everything that's possible to exist at a fundamental level, which is one uniform thing. It is doing everything that it can at a fundamental level, which essentially is just being. I have two kind of metaphors for this. One is the point that is being tugged in every direction equally. So think of a point on a piece of paper, and it is being tugged in every equal and opposite direction with equal amounts. So even though it is doing everything it can, it is in balance. So it's not actually changing at all. Another way I like to think of it is like a piece of paper of which has every single possible drawing on it. Now, what does that piece of paper look like now? Almost like another blank piece of paper, but now just, if we're using a pencil, now just completely filled in with the gray-black lead. If it was a black page and we were using colors, I imagine it would now be a white page, because isn't all colors at once white? I think that's the case. Anyways, It's a good idea to think of Simnia as pure potential of everything all at once. So how do we get these separations? We know logically you can't shadow a light, but you can light a shadow. But through illusion, you can shadow a light. And I explained the great simulation before. I'll have to explain it again probably for this video, but I think this is another great way to explain it. Through illusion, Simnia is being shadowed. If you were to think of Simnia as light, it is being shadowed. Even though that is logically impossible, it is illusionary or simulatedly possible. So rather than the fundamental existence being a small particle, the fundamental existence is actually all pure potential all at once, and then it gets covered in shadow, if that makes sense, to create separate instances. The great simulation. So Simnia is everything that it can exist at the fundamental level, and it is doing everything it can at the fundamental level. What does that mean? It means it is in balance. What is balance? Well, its prior cause is everything all at once, but what is its post effect? Stasis or no change. So what is Simnia's awareness experiencing? Simnia has awareness because Aliyam nihil, which is the different nothing, which is what I call non-existence. It is the exact opposite of Simnia. Aliyah doesn't have awareness because there's nothing to be aware of. I say Aliyah has ignorance. Simnia has awareness. So what is this awareness experiencing? Well, really it's experiencing balance. But what is this balance? Its awareness is experiencing nothing through this balance. By its own default state, it is simulating as if it were experiencing nothing. Now we know nothing doesn't exist, and it can't ever. It is never. So it's not a real nothingness. So we actually have essentially a combination kind of going on. It's as if Simnia were to give some of its perfection to the imperfection. So really what it's experiencing, so it actually experiences something even though it's experiencing nothing. And what we can associate with nothing, if it were to be existent, it's kind of like a what if. Like, what if nothing could exist, or at least partially exist? And that what if is randomness, chaos, separation, imbalance, irrational. By Simnia's default state, it experiences all of its pure potential, even though it's by its own default state imbalance. Its awareness is experiencing imbalance. And that's causes separation. So me, you, everyone else, every other aware being, all of our awarenesses are only illusionarily separated. We actually all share the same Simnia awareness. So what's kind of the point of this? Well, if we were to metaphorically personify Simnia, we can say, well, Simnia has everything rational because Simnia is a connected thing. Connection is associated with the rational because you have the logical steps that are connected to each other, whereas irrational is completely random, that is disconnect, that is separation. So irrational with Aliyah, rational with Simnia. You can associate everything in this life here that we're experiencing, you can associate kind of like on a spectrum where Aliyah is on one side, Simnia is on the other. This is like Plato's divided line. Mathematics, form on the higher end, the rational, towards Simnia. In fact, this is the Plato's divided line, but kind of in my new way of connecting everything. So yeah, mathematics and the forms with Simnia, or I think what he calls the good or something like that. And then opinion or emotions, you know, are fairly irrational. You can't really rationalize them, but you can empathize them and experience them. That's how you learn the irrational. You can't rationalize the irrational, like, so you have to experience it. So Simnia has everything by default state that is rational. So it wants what it doesn't have, which is the irrational. The irrational doesn't actually exist. Let me clarify this. Simnia has everything that actually exists by default. So Simnia has everything, so it wants nothing. That statement's interesting because it can mean multiple things. It already has everything, so it couldn't want anything else. Also, this is us using perspective. Simnia wants to learn the irrational. It wants to experience the irrational. It wants to experience the imbalance. To learn the irrational, you have to experience it. How do you're watching a random number generator. There's no way to properly figure out what next number is going to be generated. You can only just sit there and wait for the next number to be generated in a truly random number generator, which true randomness is not existent at all. And so our souls, essentially experiencing separation, go through these lives and learn the irrational. And eventually, towards the end, it's like you've learned enough, you've experienced enough, your soul's been tempered and trained, and you say, that was great, and that was awful, that was fun, and that was terrifying. I was courageous, I was an awful being. I did great things, I did terrible things, I loved people, I hurt people. I learned. Now I realize I don't need any of that. I already have everything that I could ever possibly want by default. I am perfect by default. My soul is everything that actually exists. I am Simnia. I am in balance. This is all just the great simulation, the great illusion, the great dilution. This world, which I call the intermedius, it's the spectrum in the middle between Alihil and Simnia, is the finite, or the forever temporary. It is finite because Simnia is infinite. Alihil is quantityless. Maybe finiteless. So infinite, infiniteless, and you have finite. Qualities of the intermedius, and one of the most important qualities is thresholds, or gradation. This is definitely from Neoplatonism. I've studied a little bit of Neoplatonism. I've mostly studied Parmenides, Plato. Everything I've learned from Neoplatonism, I've learned from Ken Wheeler. And then I really like Fractal Women, or Laurie Gardi's take on Ken Wheeler's work. And then also I connected with some other stuff like Taoism. The yin yang symbol is almost perfect. Is almost the perfect symbol, which I love and hate because it's such a like cheesy symbol at this point. But it really does perfectly display everything and nothing, because even though everything and nothing are complete opposites, they have some sort of strange similarity. You know, that circle of each other that they have, the two halves, yin and yang. Anyways, what is thresholds of the intermedius? Thresholds mean, whereas in Simnia we would say, oh, between two numbers. I mean, even on our mathematics, we still use math like this, but this is just kind of how I'm trying to explain it. Simnia thinking is kind of like between two numbers is an infinite amount of other fractions and numbers, right? In the intermedius, we're governed by maybe, you know, I mean, obviously we're being governed by the absolute like that, but we have finite, meaning that there is a step. Eventually it goes from 1 to 2 instead of just like an infinite amount of steps in between. There is points of phase shifts, solid to liquid to gas. You know, with ice is from x to y degrees, and then after it passes y degrees, it starts melting. So you have that threshold period, and then once you get to y degrees, I'm using a variable y. Once you get to the letter y variable in degrees, you pass that threshold, and now it changes state. So there's a oh, here we go, it's a good way to explain it. There's both stasis and change. So you have a threshold such that eventually when a quality is tweaked enough, it causes a change into a new stasis or state. That is a very important attribute of the intermedius of this world. Because this world has a beginning, it also has an ending. And after that ending, well, since Simnia is infinite and never changes, there'll be another beginning. And I'm still trying to figure this out, but it actually almost seems as if Simnia is every potential. It is the potential of every possible universe all at once. Which helps with jealousy, because within Simnia you can say, well, even though in this realm I'm not experiencing so and so that you're jealous of, there exists an infinite amount of other realities in potential, meaning unmanifest or potentially manifest by their awarenesses. I don't know how it works in details. Anyways, I'm going into parts that I'm not too certain on yet, but intermedius has thresholds and it's finite. Ali Hill. Ali Hill is nothing, does nothing. It is completely separated. It is in a state of 100% absolute change, and I only say that as reference to Simnia's absolute stasis, because Simnia's absolute stasis grounds it as an existent thing, whereas because Ali Hill is in a absolute state of change, it's never grounded as an existent thing. You can see how they're opposites like that. Ali Hill is the imbalanced. It is the irrational. It has no rules, which is interesting because for a long time I'm like, well, did there start with non-existence, and then because there was no rules, eventually existence came out of non-existence? But no, because I would say non-existence is never. That implies time, that implies an initial state, and then implies Simnia as a secondary state. So in that case, I would call, even though there are no rules, here's the case. Simnia is rationally restricted. Ali Hill is irrationally restricted. Meaning, even though it doesn't have any rules to say that nothing can come from something, it's irrationally restricted. It is never, ever. So nothing ever will come from it. It is never. It's, yes, it's never. Ali Hill. So Simnia is everything, has everything, does everything, so it wants nothing. We can think of Ali Hill as the exact opposite. I like to call Ali Hill as the parasite. It is nothing, it does nothing, and it wants everything. Another way you can think of the intermedius being created is through this. Essentially, Simnia being self-sufficient, self-reliant. It's not reliant on others because we used the same rational as before. If it was reliant on something else, well, firstly, that would imply something else, and we know that nothing else can exist. And then also, if it relied on something else, then what else? Then what is that thing relying on? Something else, then something else, then something else. So, what? And then also we can say Ali Hill is otherly reliant on others in two kind of ways, both diluted and absolute, because Ali Hill is a complete pure absence, so it's not a thing on its own. It's only the absence of something, so it's not a thing on its own. This I learned from Ken Wheeler. Shadow is a privation of light. Shadow isn't a thing on its own. Light is a thing. Shadow is the absence of a thing. Ali Hill is not a thing on its own. So while Simnia is self-reliant, self-sufficient, it is a thing on its own. Ali Hill is otherly reliant. We can also, so to explain the intermediates again, we can also say that source, sorry, I also call Simnia source sometimes. I like it's confusing, so I'll keep calling it Simnia. Simnia is also abundant. It can, because it's infinite, well, how do we put this? Not only does it have enough for itself, it's really only best to think of this, I think, as of right now, because I don't know how to perfectly fit this in. My hair looks weird. Simnia is self-sufficient, and if we were to think of Simnia as being abundant, meaning it can give and give and give and always remain full, Ali Hill we can think as the opposite. Ali Hill can take and take and take and always remain empty. Right. And so what is going on in this exchange is the creation and destruction of the intermedius, this world. see. Oh, what's interesting, so I mentioned earlier how Ali Hill, even though you would think, oh, it doesn't have rules, so technically something could come from nothing, but then I explained, well, if we were to imply that non-existence was first, well, firstly, that implies it's a thing, because if it is first, then that's an existent thing, and the thing is that Ali Hill is never, and so, anyways, it's irrationally restricted, so even though technically it has no rules to restrict it, it is irrationally restricted, because it's just purely, it just doesn't exist and it can't exist. But its diluted form kind of breaks this rule. When Simnia simulates, it is in a sense creating something from nothing, but only in like a simulation. Like think of like computers. Our computers create something from nothing in a virtual world. I really like the holographic theory, holographic theory, or whatever it's called. Kind of reminds me of field theory, and it's a very good way to think of it. It's like, so this diluted version of nothingness that Simnia experiences in the great simulation, which is through balance, because balance is post-effect, is nothing, even though its prior cause is everything all at once. So the awareness is experiencing nothing. It's experiencing a diluted nothing, so not a true nothing. It's a simulated nothing. So it's as if we were to say, well, what if nothing could be something? So now we're saying, so in this, what if nothing could be something, the diluted nothing or the simulated nothing, that is when we could say something can come from nothing, because it's similar to computers generating something from nothing. It's not real. It's a simulation. So in absolute reality, non-existence will never exist. It is never. Ali Hill is never. Non-existence is never. If you were to say that it is first, then you're saying it is a thing. It can't be first because it is never. Existence is always. But in its diluted form, if we were to say, well, what if nothing was kind of something, then we can kind of be like, all right, now we can kind of mess with the rules a little bit. Now we're getting something from nothing, but really it's an illusion. This whole world that we live in is an illusion. Not to invalidate it. It's very, very valid. It's the perfect illusion. And it's made and it is simulated by the perfectly real and existent thing. And our awareness is real. So that's the most important thing. Our awareness is very, very real. So even though this world is illusionary, our awareness still is experiencing is still experiencing the illusion. So don't invalidate it. And I would say we do, in a sense, have simulated free will. So even though overall Simnia is deterministic, since it can never change, since it is in stasis, it has simulated free will. So it's kind of the same thing. It's like, while we're here, it is technically real. But it's overall deterministic, because no matter how we go through this intermedius, the ending will be the same. This is more Neoplatonist terminology, emanation and then transcendence back. And recently I've been associating emanation with memory allocation and randomness, and then transcendence with harmony, organization, and return, I guess, if that makes any sense. I think this is coming up on half an hour. These aren't going to be perfect videos. I'm just trying to do my best in one takes. And I'm too hard on myself when I made videos before to make them perfect. And I'm never going to be able to make the perfect video explaining, and I'm always going to make mistakes in them. So please also go easy on me and correct me if you think there's something you can correct. Correct me and help me figure this out. Help me fill in the blanks. Let's all figure this out. I want to eventually write the book. I call it the Omnil, the Omnia Nihil, the Everything Nothing. And I want it to be by everyone and no one, like the author, the Omnil, the Omnia Nihil, by everyone and no one. Anyways, thanks everyone.